Progress is not linear. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, we've always known this. We just rarely stop long enough to actually look at it. When we think about design, about technology, about the way we structure our daily lives, there is this assumption baked into the way we move forward that newer means better, that the latest iteration is the most refined, that we are always climbing. But when you actually trace the timeline of how things develop, whether it's furniture design, software interfaces, the way cities are built, the way food is prepared, what you find is something far more chaotic. Peaks that were abandoned, solutions that were discovered, discarded, and then rediscovered decades later with great fanfare, as if they were new. The concept of Goldilocks zone can and should be applied to design and technology. The point on any given timeline where a thing, an object, a system, or a practice lands in full alignment with its own nature, not because it's the newest version or because the most advanced technology went into it, but because the principles of it are genuinely aligned with what it is, how it should function, and how it interacts with us, with how we actually are. The problem is that progress tends to overshoot that zone. We discover something that works almost perfectly, and rather than pausing to understand why it works, we keep moving. We assume the next version will be even better because that's the direction we're facing. And sometimes we're right. But a lot of the time, what we actually do is move away from something that was already, in the deepest sense, correct. If you go back to a particular window between the 20th and the 21st century, you'll recognize that there was a certain texture to daily life that I think we've largely lost, and largely without noticing up until this point. It had to do with how we consumed and experienced life and media, music, film, news, art. The physical constraints of the technology at the time created an unintentional bottleneck. Records and CDs had a finite amount of music on them. A film came in a specific physical format. There were scheduled broadcasts. There were limitations built into the medium and life itself. Technologically, yes, those were the problems to be solved. But what those limitations were doing, entirely by accident, was creating a tempo, a pace of consumption that happened to be deeply aligned with how we humans actually process experience. You had these distinct, separate fragments of daily life that were dedicated to a specific type of activity. You listened to an album, you watched a film, you read the paper. These were their own contained experiences, and because of that containment, your attention had somewhere to land. Your brain had something to hold on to for just a little bit longer. There was room to actually be inside the thing you were consuming. What those constraints produced was unintentional intentionality. The technology put you in the present moment simply by having no other option left to offer you. And boredom was a part of this. When there is nothing coming at you, the mind latches onto something, anything. It starts moving things around, fiddling, observing. There is always an activity, always an orientation. The stillness between experiences was the space in which the previous experience was actually metabolized. You carried the film with you as you walked home. The album stayed in your head for the rest of the day. The information had room to become something within your mind. But there is another dimension to this that we rarely account for, and it has to do with tangibility, with the physicality of the objects through which we once experienced things. Human experience at its most fundamental level is a collection of signals, a collection of sensory inputs arriving simultaneously from the full array of what we are capable of perceiving. And the vast majority of human history, that is exactly how experience worked, how life worked. Every meaningful interaction with the world moved through multiple senses at once, because the world was physical, and physical things have texture, weight, temperature, smell, They have a presence that you encounter before you even get to the information they carry. There was something genuinely remarkable about a certain period of media, and again, this was limitation, purely limitation, is that the physicality of the objects was inseparable from the experience of the content. You could not access music without first handling the object that contained it, whether it's an instrument or a record. You could not watch the film without a certain kind of space, a certain kind of atmosphere, time of day. You could not read the news without the particular feel of paper in your hands. The texture was structural. It was a part of how the experience arrived. Everything had weight to it. The artworks were large enough to actually look at them. The textures had a specific feel. There was a specific smell. And I think anyone who spent real time with physical media knows exactly what I'm talking about, because the smell alone is kind of a memory trigger that nothing digital has ever replicated. The CD has its own version of this, the casing, the booklet, the act of clicking while opening it. What this produced, and intentionally, was richness. But richness not in the sense of resolution. The experience moved through the full spectrum of our physical senses, and because of that, it embedded differently. It created a more distinct mark in time, a richer memory. You were physically inside the act of receiving it. The body was involved, the hands were involved, the sense of space, the temperature of the room, the specific quality of the light, all of it working together to draw you into an experience as its own contained, almost secluded element over your day, something that was actually separate. And that is a crucial distinction between a passing moment and something you actually live through and experience. What defines something in that way is that it has enough dimension to be received by your mind and your body, enough texture, enough weight, enough sensory presence that your whole self is engaged. And once you are living through such moments or interact with such an object, you're present, but not by choice or by effort or by your mental discipline, just because the physicality of the thing put you there. The design of current technology has been moving in one consistent direction: streamlining, getting the information to you faster with less friction through fewer steps, with fewer objects in between. And the fewer objects in between, the fewer senses involved, until eventually information arrives almost exclusively through the visual channel, with sound as a secondary layer, and everything else largely omitted. But the things that were omitted were never technologically important, or functionally. No engineer decided to remove the smell. Sometimes the weight is a problem, because those things were never considered part of the design to begin with. They disappeared as a side effect of efficiency, but they were absolutely a part of the experience, and their absence is felt, even though we don't have the exact language for what we're missing. What remains is faster, cleaner, and significantly easier to forget. A passing moment does not embed. It does not create the kind of distinct sensory mark that makes a memory durable. You watched it, you heard it, it was gone. The next thing was already there. The experience had no texture to hold on to. It passed through your mind rather than landing in it. And this is exactly where the noise begins. The bandwidth of available information accelerated past a certain threshold, and past that point something changes. And to mention the quality of any single piece of content is completely beside the point. When everything is thrown at you fast enough, the edges between discernment or experience dissolve. One thing bleeds into the next, and the standalone moment or a memory collapses. What was once a signal becomes noise. Because in a sense, the tempo of human consciousness The speed at which we genuinely process, integrate, and metabolize experience is something closer to a universal constant. Because after all, the days are still the same length, the seasons don't move faster. There is a certain rhythm to how we exist in time, and that rhythm carries a reason. It is part of the design. And when you treat human consciousness bandwidth as a design specification, the fixed point around which everything else should orient, the entire problem changes around. We can talk about certain biological functions that perhaps have a parallel function as our own mind. We can talk about digestion. From a purely mechanical standpoint, digestion is a bottleneck. It takes time, it produces waste, it has constraints. The slowness is not incidental to what it does. The slowness is part of how it works. Rushing it produces damage rather than better nutrition. And the same principle holds for how we consume information, experience, and art. There is a digestion process for consciousness. It has a reason for its speed and its spectrum. And what arrives through a single channel, stripped of texture, weight, smell, spatial presence, is a completely compressed file. It's definitely faster to transfer, easier to store, but fundamentally lower in resolution than the original. It is at this point where grounding becomes essential, because what the physicality of an object or an experience actually does, beyond the richness of the memory it creates, is ground you. It gives you a location, a pinpoint in time, space, in your mind. I am here, I am now. This is what my hands are touching. This is what my body is registering. This is the present moment. When you get drawn into an uninterrupted stream of visual information, something starts to loosen, something akin to awareness of yourself and of time, the perception of where you are in it, the sense of your own state of mind and your location within your mind, and the quality of what you're feeling. All of it starts to blur the edges. And this is what happens when a being designed to be grounded in a multi-sensory physical reality exists primarily inside a single channel of information, which is moving at a very high speed. The discernment erodes and the awareness softens. You lose the thread back to yourself. So the issue of grounding is the loss of the body as a participant in an experience. When the body is no longer there, you're somewhere in the stream of this extremely fast pace of information, somewhere between the last thing and the next thing, without a clear sense of what is happening right now. There was a particular technological and cultural moment somewhere in the arc and the glue points of the 20th and the 21st century where the density of available information, the tempo of media consumption, and the physical texture of the objects through which we consumed it were, quite accidentally, calibrated to the right ratio, grounded in the physical world, but distributed across senses, moving at a pace that left room for experience to actually become experience and memory. And it is very important to mention that there were also periods before that where things were simply too slow, too inconvenient, and too disconnected. And that carried its own cost. A vacuum of interconnection is its own kind of damage. So that glue point zone was specific. We passed through it without stopping to understand what made it work at the time. Progress continued, the information sped up, the objects became screens, and the screens became everything. And that window closed behind us without any ceremony. So where does that leave us now? Previous generations carried the bottleneck structurally. It was built into the technology. Slowness was the default. Well, slowness was the fastest at the time, but the physicality was unavoidable. Now, slowness is an act of will. Physicality is a choice. Intentionality has to be a practice rather than a byproduct of constraint. And beyond the personal, beyond the individual choice to consume more carefully, there is a larger design argument. The technology should be built around human form and consciousness. The tempo of life, the design of the environments we inhabit, the interfaces we see and receive information, the materials we touch and interact with, all of it should treat the speed and the sensory nature of how we genuinely process experience as the fixed point. The architecture of what we are is the specification. Because the current trajectory has a visible endpoint. Everything fed directly into the brain, the body removed, maximum information density and zero sensory texture, complete disconnection from the physical world. And I think it is a profound misunderstanding of what we are and how we actually function. Our connection to the physical world, to the environment, to the materials around us, to the planet we are standing on, is a fundamental requirement. It is the ground under our feet in the most literal possible sense. That conversation about technology, about design, about how we build the environments we live inside has to include this as a core principle. The discernment we need now is the ability to look at what we've built, trace back to where it stopped serving what it was supposed to serve in its best ability, and understand clearly at what point did we overshoot the zone. Because the zone existed for different genres, different objects, and different progress directions. We passed through many of them. The physicality of experience is a feature. It is the essence of being alive, and our connection to the physical world, to the full spectrum of how we actually experience it, is equally as important as anything our intellect will ever build. And once we understand that progress is less of a timeline and more of an open field, an ocean where certain solutions have been found ages ago and certain implementations are only now to be discovered, combining the two, I hope, with enough clarity, will create that zone where we can build our way back towards time with purpose, time with the body and the mind included.